So last week, President Cyril Ramaphosa was inaugurated and is still yet to announce his cabinet while the country awaits this imminent announcement. Who decides on critical decisions in departments? Well, to answer that question, we're joined by public policy lecturer at the Wits School of Governance. And of course, he's also a political analyst, Matlala Setlhalogile. Matlala, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think one of the questions that has been asked over and over again as we await the announcement of that cabinet is, how is it that our departments are running? We're hearing over and over again the DGs are in place and that government continues to run. But to what extent is that taking place? And is the lack of ministers in any way a hindrance to the functions of our departments?
Morning, Naledi. Naledi, I think firstly, when we talk about governance, I think the spotlight is on good governance. There might be governance processes in place, but are they efficient and effective without cabinet in place? And I think that should be our concern as a country. But besides that, the constitution tends to be quite vague in terms of the timeframes that the president ought to appoint a cabinet. Look, I'm not a law expert, and I say this with caution. One would assume that the lacuna in terms of those timeframes were an understanding and appreciation from those who drafted the constitution that appointment or selection of cabinet ultimately remains a political process. One would believe that the drafters of the constitutions did not necessarily want to encroach on that political space. But with that said, cabinet in itself remains mostly a decision-making body because the executive authority is only vested in the president. The constitution as well is not necessarily prescriptive on the appointment of cabinet, but when one reads the constitution, one will get a sense that it was sort of an expectation that cabinet would be appointed. Remember that ours is a parliamentary system that mimics the Westminster parliamentary system adopted from Great Britain, where, anyway, the cabinet system originated from. So the expectation was that cabinet would be in place, but the lack of time frames in terms of the constitution seeks to instill that sense of a political process rather than a legal process per se.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is you talk about that ambiguity then, and I wonder what happens then in the middle of that, right, and what the impact is. I mean, you've got to certainly ask yourself, are taxpayers still footing the bill, for instance, for ministerial privileges for the ministers of the 6th administration?
Technically, the minute President Ramaphosa took his oath on the 19th, cabinet was dissolved because the constitution clearly states that once the president assumes office and cabinet ceases to exist. And in any case, one would assume that the benefits per se and all the incentives that come with being part of cabinet do not necessarily, or rather not necessarily taken away immediately afterwards. I think some still receive remuneration and certain benefits for a few months after exiting office.
Yeah, that's going to be something to be looked at, right? Can we talk a little bit about the role of DGs and one of their very own limitations? I mean, one of the people that Newzroom Afrika certainly spoke to is Biki Grief of the South African National Defence Union, who, on speaking of the deaths of soldiers in the DRC and that mortar attack, says, well, it doesn't help that we don't have a government in place at the moment to shoulder the responsibility of, for instance, what is happening in the DRC. And a good question is, well, is that true? Do we, in fact, not have a government in place? And in a moment like this, who shoulders the responsibility?
Technically, with the election of president, we have a government and we have a public service that continues to function. But I think one of the things that many people are not paying attention to is the other arm of government has been impacted by the delay in appointing cabinet. You'd remember that Parliament, the National Assembly, which is the National Council of Provinces and the National Assembly, met on Tuesday, where decisions on which committees to establish and the sizes of the different committees were deliberated on. The National Council of Provinces has actually concluded its work in that regard and actually established 10 committees for the National Council of Provinces. With the National Assembly, it is a different story. The National Assembly is yet to establish committees of Parliament for the 7th administration due to the absence of cabinet, because one would get a sense that the structuring and the establishment of those committees will be influenced by the nature of the cabinet. So in essence, the lack of cabinet appointment, or rather delay in appointing cabinet, has effectively affected the work of the legislature. Because people tend to forget that during the 6th administration, there were talks about reconfiguring cabinet. I remember the SONA, whether it's 2022 SONA or so, one can't recall precisely. But also, the Minister of Finance did allude to that in the midterm budget policy statement, to say that the work of reconfiguring cabinet is proceeding smoothly at the time. Whether we're going to see a similar cabinet to that of the 6th administration remains a mystery at this point, because ultimately the executive authority, as I've indicated, is vested in the president, and the president ultimately is the one who assigns the different powers to different ministers. So the appointment could reconfigure the cabinet quite extensively, and that's why the work of the National Assembly has suffered in the process. But we do have a government, but whether it's a fully functional government, that's the question here.
You know, obviously we need to also catch up with where we are with these negotiations, right? And you've got reports this morning of the ANC having offered the Democratic Alliance a take it or leave it final chance, right? Allegedly, that essentially involves 6 cabinet posts of course, there's the discussion as well around the position of Deputy Minister of Finance on the table. And I want to talk a little bit about how you feel about these negotiations and where some of the deadlock may be. I mean, you see, for instance, Professor Thuli Madonsela also having come out and said, well, as part of the GNU statement of intent, parties do require consensus to pass new policies. Is that a big bottleneck?
Yeah, remember that government now is not a single party. Government will be comprised of different political parties, so there should be consensus in agreeing on a joint policy program. And in terms of the negotiations, as I've indicated, the prerogative or the executive power is vested in the president, and ultimately the prerogative to appoint cabinet still remains the president's one. But the reality here is that the president will have to take into consideration the different political parties that are part of this coalition that is being passed as the government of national unity, in appointing those cabinet members. So yeah, those are some of the things that are in play here in terms of where the negotiations lie and how ultimately they affect the delay in appointing cabinet.
Yeah, but there's obviously the question of who the president is listening to as he, sets out to make this decision. You've got, for instance, COSATU, the tripartite alliance partner, coming out just yesterday, speaking just on the makeup of our National Assembly, right, and saying that Zizi Kodwa, for instance, must be removed from Parliament. That's a tripartite alliance partner. So is there a sense that he's being quite selective about who he's listening to?
From a political party perspective, the president ought to listen to people in the tripartite alliance, those who are in an alliance with the ANC and the ANC itself. But from a state perspective, it's a constitutional obligation for the president that he must promote the unity, the unity of South Africans in advancing the interest and the development of the Republic. While President Ramaphosa remains the president of the ANC, he is now as well the president of the country. And in exercising his duties, he must take into account the need to foster unity in the Republic. And that's a constitutional obligation. It's not something that people think would be nice, but it is a constitutional obligation.
Yeah, in the offer made to the Democratic Alliance, reportedly this morning, the president, reports rather from this morning, the president giving John Steenhuisen up until Sunday to respond to that offer. I mean, what do you think about that sense of urgency?
As we said earlier, Naledi, government is in place, but the optimal functioning of government remains in question. Because I think when we talk about government, or rather governance, we essentially say talking about good governance. It's just that the good tends to be silent more often than not. So the expectation would be that the longer the cabinet announcement takes, the more affected the good governance aspect of governing is impacted by this. Hence, I think there tends to be these deadlines that are given to the various political parties. But as I said, the constitution was not quite prescriptive, because our electoral system and the nature of our multi-party democracy actually makes allowances for coalition governments. And I think the draft of the constitution would have foreseen an instance where a coalition government is required, but they needed to take into account that the political process of actually forming government where coalition government is needed might be something that takes a bit of time. I think we've seen in different parts of the world where negotiations to actually ultimately form government have been protracted.
Yeah. Well, we're going to leave it there, Matlala, as we await the announcement, and we wait with bated breath. Of course, Matlala Setlhalogile, their political analyst, is speaking to us.